Let's put the women and children to bed and go looking for dinner. Jon Rothstein here on Inside College Basketball now as we continue with our preseason content for the 25-26 college basketball season. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball now on both Apple and Spotify. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. Now, as we've been doing on this show, we are going to set the table for a number of topics entering the 25-26 college basketball season. In many episodes, we have looked at the different leagues in college basketball and given you key storylines and themes to keep an eye out for in those conferences during the upcoming season. We've also looked at some of the players to watch in 25-26. Today, we are going to take a little bit of a different theme, and we are going to look at the coaches that are on the rise. And in this show, I'm going to give you 10 coaches on the rise entering the 25-26 college basketball season. Now, I want to issue a bit of a disclaimer. There are many coaches who will not be on this list that have already risen and done certain things in college basketball as a non-power conference or a mid-major head coach. For example, Mitch Henderson a couple of years ago led Princeton to the Sweet 16. He's not on this list. He's already risen. Russell Turner, a great coach at UC Irvine for a long time, won a game in the NCAA tournament in 2019 against Kansas State. He's not on this list. Same can be said of another Big West head coach, Joe Pasternak, who has already cemented himself as a guy who has taken UC Santa Barbara to multiple NCAA tournaments. And they should have another great team this year. So those guys are already known commodities in the mid-major space. This is a little bit different. You can also add Yale's James Jones to that as well, who's done a great job in New Haven. These are guys who, again, might be a little bit less known now, but over the next year or two could become names that are synonymous with the up-and-comers of the sport as people transition from mid-major jobs to power conference jobs. The first name on the list, and these are in no particular order, is Chris Gerlufsen from San Francisco. Now, one of the main reasons why I wanted to start with Chris Gerlufsen was I am a big fan and an advocate when there is a blueprint in place from a program for a coach to be in a scenario where he can jump to other programs. And what I mean is this. You look at the last two coaches at San Francisco. Todd Golden went from San Francisco to Florida, won a national championship. Kyle Smith went from San Francisco to Washington State, led Washington State to an NCAA tournament win, and is now the head coach at Stanford. So he's gotten two other jobs, Washington State and Stanford, since being at San Francisco. Chris Gerlufsen is somebody that has quietly made San Francisco a top-tier program in the West Coast Conference. San Francisco has went to each of the last postseason NITs, and in the last three seasons, the Dons have won 68 games under Gerlufsen's watch. This is a team, I think, that will be right at the top of the West Coast Conference this year with Gonzaga and St. Mary's. Now, in order for a coach like this to separate himself, in order for a coach like this, and I've been in his practices, and he does a great job, obviously, keeping his guys accountable and, in terms of his execution, in order for a coach like this to break through, you've got to move the needle. You've got to be in a scenario where you beat Gonzaga, where you beat St. Mary's, where you get to the NCAA tournament. And one big thing you have to look at now is we're evaluating all these coaches who are in non-power conferences. It is exceptionally more difficult for these guys to get to the NCAA tournament in these one-bid leagues because we're in a scenario now where you are not going to get nearly the amount of opportunities to build a resume as you would maybe 10 or 15 years ago. There's been exceptions to the rule. Todd Golden, in his final year at San Francisco, was in a scenario where he was able to put together an at-large resume for the NCAA tournament, and that led them getting the Florida job. San Francisco lost to Murray State that year in the round of 64. And that is obviously the hope if you are Chris Gerlufsen and San Francisco this year. And the Dons very quietly have put together an extremely aggressive non-conference schedule for a West Coast Conference school. At Memphis, Minnesota in the Sanford Pentagon, Colorado, a Big 12 opponent in Palm Springs, and then either Nevada or Washington in Palm Springs. a neutral site game, even though it's in Mississippi, in Tupelo against Mississippi State, at St. Louis, Loyola Chicago in the Chase Center. So you throw those games in with Gonzaga, with St. Mary's, there is a foundation in place right now for San Francisco from a scheduling perspective to, if they win their share of games, have a chance to be an at-large team in the NCAA tournament. But you got to answer the bell in November and December. And here's one thing I want to point out. Being in a mid-major conference, and coaches have told me this over the years and so many years covering the sport, adds crazy amounts of pressure when you're in a mid-major conference tournament, because it all comes down to 3 days in March. And I have seen dreams shattered during mid-major conference tournaments for guys who had everything leading up to that point in place, and then they get in a scenario where things do not come to fruition in March. But if you are a West Coast Conference school and you are a coach like a Chris Gerlufsen trying to rise and be in a scenario where you can be a candidate for better jobs, if you do not put yourself in position to get in that large, then you are putting the entire onus on getting to the NCAA tournament by winning the West Coast Conference tournament, which means you're going to have to beat St. Mary's or Gonzaga in early March. That is not an advantageous situation. But I'm a believer in Chris Gerlufsen. I think if San Francisco can move the needle, if San Francisco can beat Gonzaga or St. Mary's, if San Francisco can be in play for an at-large berth, you are going to see somebody who will be transportable and can follow Kyle Smith and Todd Golden as somebody who could be somebody who can advance. I'm a big fan of San Francisco's team. I went out there last year for a practice. Ryan Beasley is back. Tyrone Riley, a name to keep an eye on if you're a West Coast fan, who I think will be a breakout player on that side of the country this year, was able to return to the Dons after flirting with the transfer portal. Vuk Masic, a transfer from Portland, is also in play. And there's also several other power conference transfers that were brought into San Francisco. Guillermo Diaz-Graham from Pitt, Mookie Cook from Oregon, and also a guy who was not from a power conference but is a good player is David Fuchs from Rhode Island. So I'm bullish on San Francisco, and I'm interested to follow the Dons in the non-conference portion of the schedule. Again, a schedule that gives San Francisco and Chris Gerlufsen a chance to put together an at-large resume for the NCAA tournament. Number 2 on our list, and again, these are in no particular order, is Drew Valentine at Loyola Chicago. Now, Drew Valentine, to me, looks like he has all the requisites to be a power conference coach in the near future. The guy's got great pedigree. He was a GA at Michigan State under Tom Izzo. He's the brother of Denzel Valentine, the former Michigan State star, who's also obviously been, in the NBA. And he has also done a tremendous job taking over for Porter Moser at Loyola Chicago. It's never easy to be the guy that follows the guy in coaching, but Drew Valentine has done that. And if you think about the run that Loyola Chicago had under Porter Moser, 2018, go to the Final Four. 2021, you beat Georgia Tech and Illinois and go to the Sweet 16. So during that stretch, 18, 19, no tournament in 20, and also 2021, in that stretch, okay, of 3 NCAA tournaments, Loyola Chicago is in the second weekend twice. Drew Valentine comes in, so young at the time, getting that job, and right away, he takes the Ramblers to the NCAA tournament in 2022. Lost to Ohio State, wins the Missouri Valley Conference. Then, Loyola Chicago goes to the Atlantic 10 from the Missouri Valley. A little bit better of a league, obviously, and there's a transitional period. It's a struggle in the first season. But Drew Valentine's adjustments during this stretch over the past couple of years have been absolutely incredible, in my opinion. He has won a number of games during the last 2 years. He's made Loyola Chicago one of the best programs in the Atlantic 10. And I also think when you look at this dynamic that we're seeing now at Loyola Chicago, he has done everything except get to the NCAA tournament since he's been in the Atlantic 10. And if this guy can take the Ramblers to the NCAA tournament out of 2 conferences, you are looking at somebody who, again, could be transportable as early as next spring. Drew Valentine was in play last year at a number of power conference jobs, was in the mix at Xavier. He comes back to Loyola Chicago. The difficult part, and I'm going to keep saying this because I think it's a real thing, of being in a job like this when you have a really good team and you've solidified yourself as a good coach with a good program is this: getting quality non-conference games. And Loyola Chicago is not going to be able to get power conference opportunities in November and December. So if you can't get power conference opportunities, you ask yourself, how realistic is it for us to be an NCAA tournament team with an at-large bid? That's the dynamic that you're dealing with if you're Loyola Chicago. Certain brands, okay, are in a scenario like Dayton, like VCU, much like Memphis or San Diego State or UNLV, where you can get invited to certain tournaments where you're going to get games of significance in tournaments on neutral courts that will move the needle. But if you're Loyola Chicago, that sometimes is a bit of a struggle, and other programs as well. But Drew Valentine, to me, has done a great job at Loyola Chicago, went to the tournament the first year out of the Missouri Valley Conference, and is also in a scenario, too, where he's got a really, really good team again. He's got one of the best shot blockers in the country that not enough people know about in Miles Rubin. He's added power conference transfers in Joshua Ola Joseph and also Xavier Amos from Cal and Wisconsin, respectively. And I firmly expect Loyola Chicago to be in the mix with VCU, with Dayton, with St. Louis atop the Atlantic 10. And this is just going back to what I was saying in terms of the pressure on these coaches in one bid leagues. You can have seasons now where you win 21, 22, 23 games, and it has no bearing on the fact of whether or not you're going to be in the NCAA tournament unless you win your conference tournament. Last year, VCU wins 28 games, and if it didn't win the Atlantic 10 conference tournament, it wouldn't have been in the NCAA tournament. And what did 28 wins get Ryan Odom and VCU last year? An 11 seed. The pressure in these mid-major leagues is immense. Now let's go to another Atlantic 10 head coach who is also in the conference and is the reigning Atlantic 10 coach of the year, and that's Tony Skinn at George Mason. There are sometimes you come across people in life that just have the it factor. That to me is Tony Skinn. Tony Skinn is a guy who was a major part of George Mason's run to the Final Four as a player in 2006 and worked his way up judiciously as an assistant coach throughout the ranks. He worked for Kevin Willard at Seton Hall before joining Chris Holtman's staff at Ohio State. He then went back to Maryland with Kevin Willard, and he ultimately became the head coach at his alma mater, George Mason. Tony Skinn, in a short period of time, has put himself on the map as a name to watch in coaching. He flirted and got some interest from Maryland and Florida State last spring. He obviously signed a long-term deal to stay at George Mason, but you're looking at somebody who had 27 wins last year, 47 wins in the last 2 years, is doing it at his alma mater. He's got great relationships, obviously, up and down the East Coast, and he's somebody, again, who is having this type of success and pretty much having a new team every single year. And the most impressive thing is this: you look at the dynamics, again, of what you have to start with at this level. You're replacing multiple starters every year. And this is another thing I want to talk about when you look at realignment. Sometimes programs are added to conferences when they have had great success previously in a lower level conference. That was George Mason going to the Atlantic 10. George Mason going to the Atlantic 10 was seen as you were adding a program that went to a Final Four out of the CAA in 2006. Tony Skinn last year took George Mason closer to the NCAA tournament than it's ever been since joining the Atlantic 10. George Mason had never been to the title game of the Atlantic 10 conference tournament until last season. And George Mason, since joining the Atlantic 10, has never been in the NCAA tournament. And that's something that's interesting. Look at the teams that have joined the Atlantic 10, which, again, was a fertile ground for coaches for a long time in terms of people moving up. Shaka Smart, Will Wade, Mike Rhodes from VCU, right? Dan Hurley, Rhode Island to UConn. Archie Miller, Dayton to Rhode Island. Since realignment, and this could all change, but since realignment, 2 programs, Loyola Chicago and George Mason, who previously went to a Final Four in a lower level, joined the Atlantic 10 and have not made the NCAA tournament since. That could obviously change. Number 4 on our list, and this again is in no particular order, is Preston Spradlin from James Madison. Now, Preston Spradlin is an interesting story because here's somebody who was a former GA at Kentucky under John Calipari, still exceptionally young as a head coach, just 38 years old right now as we're taping the show. And he's already led Morehead State to 2 NCAA tournaments and a postseason NIT. He was at James Madison in his first year last year. And one thing I evaluate when I'm looking at mid-major coaches is because the conference tournaments are so fickle. Are those coaches good enough to win their regular season title? And if you are, you're in a scenario where you obviously have the chops to do this and advance. Preston Spradlin's won at least a share wherever he's coached of his conference regular season title in the last 3 seasons. That to me is a guy who's got it. And much like I talked about with Kyle Smith, with Todd Golden, with Chris Gerlufsen, there is a blueprint for coaches to advance from James Madison. Mark Byington was at James Madison. He's now the head coach at Vanderbilt. Next up on our list, Jerrod Calhoun at Utah State. Utah State is a job that has always seemed to produce big-time head coaches, and it's got a great fan support system. Craig Smith won there, went to Utah. No longer the Utah coach, but he won there. Ryan Odom won there, got the VCU job. He's now at Virginia. Danny Sprinkle won there. He's now the head coach at Washington. Jerrod Calhoun is next on from that Utah State tree to be a riser. Jerrod Calhoun's a Bob Huggins disciple. He's somebody who did great things as a Division II coach at Fairmont State, was the NCAA Division II runner-up. He also was in a scenario at Youngstown State where he, for all intents and purposes, won 46 games during a 2-year stretch. And he also plays a very innovative offensive style, which makes Utah State, to me, one of the more aesthetically pleasing teams in all of college basketball. Another thing that you have to like about Jerrod Calhoun's prognosis, he has players back from last year's team that went to the NCAA tournament. Mason Falslev is a first-team All-Mountain West caliber player that's going to be in the mix for Mountain West Player of the Year honors. And there's other players back as well. Tucker Anderson, Carson Templin, who were part of that team that went to the NCAA tournament and lost to UCLA. I look at Jerrod Calhoun, and he signed a long-term contract last year after the season, as being somebody who can without question be a power conference head coach. And I think following up last year's run to the NCAA tournament with another berth will put him in that position. Now, one thing you got to remember too, Utah State is in a multi-bid league in the Mountain West. And next year, Utah State will join the new Pac-12 with Gonzaga, San Diego State, and a host of others. But that puts the Aggies in position to still be in a multi-bid league. And that's pivotal.
Only CBS Sports can bring you big time during the heart of Saturday afternoons. It's big time.
It's big time. It's big time. It's big time.
On CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
Get ready.
Wait a second. I thought we were going tubing.
All 3 Sonic the Hedgehog movies and Knuckles are now streaming on Paramount Plus.
And everyone loves it.
Every adventure.
Just try to keep up.
Every face-off.
This ends now.
And every moment that will have you saying,
Where have you been? My entire life!
It's showtime!
All 3 Sonic the Hedgehog movies and the entire Sonic universe are now streaming on Paramount Plus.
All right, Jon Rothstein back here on Inside College Basketball Now. I want to remind you, subscribe to Inside College Basketball Now on Apple Podcasts. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. We're the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. Also subscribe on Apple and Spotify. Talking now 10 head coaches on the rise entering the 25-26 college basketball season. We have hit 5. These are in no particular order. Chris Gerlufsen from San Francisco, Drew Valentine from Loyola, Chicago, Tony Skinn at George Mason, Preston Spradlin at James Madison, and Jerrod Calhoun from Utah State. So we got 5 more to go. Again, these are in no particular order. And again, coaches that have already had moments of promise in the past are not necessarily going to be mentioned on this list. Number 6 on the list, Takayo Siddle from UNC Wilmington. This guy was an assistant under Kevin Keatts at UNC Wilmington, went with Kevin Keatts to NC State, then came back to UNC Wilmington as the head coach, got this program to the NCAA tournament last year, was very, very competitive against Texas Tech in the round of 64. And when you look at this dynamic, it's about sustaining, I think, a level in the CAA where you a perennial contender. UNC Wilmington's been to the CAA tournament title game 3 of the last 4 years. Now, the breakthrough happened last year. But with that said, Takayo Siddle has put this program in position to be in position to make the NCAA tournament every single year. He is a guy without question that will be a name to watch moving forward. He's averaged just under 25 wins per season over the last 4 years. And here's another thing. If you're a really good mid-major coach in this climate, your players are going to be in demand. The trip to the NCAA tournament for UNC Wilmington under Takayo Siddle happened after this program lost its best player, Trezarian White, from the year prior to TCU as a transfer. Next on the list, Duane Simpkins from American. This guy's a former guard for Gary Williams at Maryland, led American to the NCAA tournament last year in just his second season as a head coach. I've known Duane Simpkins for a long time, since he was a mid-major assistant coach. This guy's got a great personality. He's got an infectious personality. He obviously has great powers of assimilation with people. People want to be around him. Deep roots in the DMV, deep roots in the East Coast, was an assistant at George Mason. I think he's somebody, as long as American continues to obviously flourish in the Patriot League, will be on the radar of a lot of ADs and search firms moving forward. He has quickly done a great job as a head coach, entering just year 3 right now. 8th on the list, Patrick Sellers at Central Connecticut. There are tough jobs in college basketball, and then there is a place like Central Connecticut where players can't talk to you about NIL because you have no NIL. Now, at Central Connecticut, they have won at least a share of the last 2 Northeast Conference regular season titles. Some tough losses in the Northeast Conference tournament because at that level you are judged so much by what you do in your respective conference tournament. But to get 45 wins in 2 years at Central Connecticut, you have to be a heck of a basketball coach. And I have known Pat Sellers since he was an assistant at UConn. And when UConn went to the Final Four in 2009, he was on the staff. And when UConn won a national championship in 2011, he wasn't on the staff, but he was the point person on a lot of those players that wound up winning a national championship. Jeremy Lamb, etc. So in terms of coaching and more specifically evaluating at the mid-major level, Pat Sellers is a hidden gem at Central Connecticut. Another guy from a program that has produced recently a power conference head coach is Dan Earl at Chattanooga. Chattanooga had a breakthrough last year, winning 29 games in the postseason NIT. Dan Earl kept things afloat at VMI before getting the Chattanooga job, but now he's in a scenario where he could be somebody, in my opinion, who, if you found a really, really tough higher level job in a power conference, he's somebody who could find a way to win. Beat UC Irvine in the NIT last year, beat Loyola Chicago, beat Dayton, got 29 wins at Chattanooga. Again, another program that has had that has had coaches ascend to higher level programs. Matt McCall went from Chattanooga to UMass. Will Wade went from Chattanooga to VCU. And as I mentioned recently, Lamont Paris went from Chattanooga to South Carolina. So all these things right now, in play, so to speak, if you're the coach at Chattanooga, there's a blueprint and a history of advancement, just like I talked about with Chris Gerlufsen at San Francisco, just like I talked about with somebody like Jerrod Calhoun at Utah State. That is what makes things a little bit more attractive when you're putting it together. And the 10th and final name on our list for 10 head coaches on the rise in the 25-26 college basketball season is Chris Crutchfield at Omaha. I have known Chris Crutchfield since he was an assistant at Oklahoma. He was the person who tipped me off about a young guard over 10 years ago that was coming to play for Oklahoma named Buddy Hield. Tremendous person, tremendous personality. Did a great job last year leading Omaha to the NCAA tournament where they lost to St. John's in the round of 64. But now the test of these coaches, in my opinion, is, are you going to be good enough in this climate to sustain your program after your program loses players to the portal and goes to power conferences? Markel Sutton went to LSU. J.J. White went to Baylor. If Chris Crutchfield can follow up last season after losing those players with another run to the NCAA tournament, he's another guy who could next spring be on the short list for a lot of bigger jobs down the road. Hard thing to understand, and I'm not a coach, but I've covered a lot of coaches in 20 plus years on this beat. A hard thing to understand, I think, is the pressure that these guys feel when they're favorites in mid-major conference tournaments. I've seen it throughout my career, and I think back to the resiliency of Steve Peichel when he was at Stony Brook. I don't know if I've ever seen a program endure more difficult losses in a mid-major conference tournament than Steve Peichel did at Stony Brook. But he persevered. He broke through. He got Stony Brook to the NCAA tournament in 2016, and that led to him being the Rutgers coach. And 10 years later, he's in a scenario where he's, going to be starting his 10th season at Rutgers and has led the Scarlet Knights to multiple NCAA tournaments. But here's the thing, too. So much of it is that delivering in 3 days in March. So much of it is timing as well. You could be a coach that goes on a major run and still not have an opportunity to advance for one reason or another. But those are 10 names, 10 coaches on the rise entering the 25-26 college basketball season. Want to remind you to subscribe to Inside College Basketball now on both Apple and Spotify. We want to be your Bible for the college basketball season and beyond. Once again, we are the only college basketball podcast coming to you 52 weeks out of the calendar year. I'm Jon Rothstein, and this is Inside College Basketball Now.